you know, seeing other women and the whole thing. I mean, it was a big, big, big disappointment in my life.
What could America's sweetheart possibly be hiding about the most magnetic man she ever loved? At 91, Shirley Jones has spoken more candidly than ever about Jack Cassidy, the dazzling Broadway star who swept her into a life of passion, fame, and chaos. She says the public saw a perfect power couple. What she lived through was far more complicated. Behind the glow was a man fighting demons, a marriage built on electric chemistry and painful secrets, and a final night that still haunts her story. The official record says one thing. Rumors and revelations suggest another. Here is what she finally says out loud, and what that truth really costs. On paper, it looked like a storybook match, a fresh-faced movie ingenue with perfect pitch and a Broadway star who could light up any room. Shirley Jones married Jack Cassidy in 1956, and for nearly 2 decades the public saw a glamorous pair who seemed to glide from stage to screen without breaking stride. The dates are not in dispute. Court records later summarized the marriage, separation in 1974, and divorce in 1975. But the image that stuck to Shirley, America's wholesome soprano, later the steady mother from the Partridge Family, hid a much messier private reality. When she finally told her story in her memoir, she made it clear that the nice girl mask had always been just that, a mask. She wrote openly about appetites, mistakes, and a marriage that could swing from intoxicating to frightening in a heartbeat. Reviews and interviews at the time emphasized how directly she punctured her spotless persona. The draw of Jack, as she describes it, was not only his talent, it was the way he took charge. He was older, worldly, and intensely persuasive. In her pages, she uses a phrase that still startles readers. He felt like a sexual Svengali, the guide who introduced her to experiences she had never imagined and pushed boundaries she did not know she would cross. That power dynamic thrilled her, until it did not. She admits that the same confidence that first felt like protection could flip into control, leaving her off balance and unsure where the performance ended and the person began. Coverage of the book captured those contrasts because they were the point, to show how love and danger can wear the same face. It also mattered who Shirley was to the audience. By the time many viewers met her as Shirley Partridge, she was selling safety and harmony on a weekly basis, exactly the opposite of what she was living at home. In later interviews, she said plainly that she wanted to puncture that cartoon, not to shock for its own sake, but to reclaim the truth. She was not a saint. Their marriage was not a fantasy, and affection does not erase damage. That candor reframed everything people thought they knew about the couple. So, the myth is easy. The Oscar winner and the Tony winner, beautiful and in sync. The marriage is harder, a bond that ran on heat, secrecy, and contradictions that only make sense once you hear her version. And she is careful about where the line really is. The devastating truth, as she frames it now, is not a new headline or a hidden crime. It is the cost of loving a brilliant man whose charisma masked deeper problems that neither of them fully faced. That is where her story starts, at the gap between what fans saw and what she lived, because everything that follows grows out of that gap. Next comes the part she once avoided saying out loud, how that private intensity spilled into the bedroom and then beyond the marriage entirely. If Shirley Jones shattered illusions with her memoir, it was in this part of her story where jaws dropped the furthest. She painted Jack Cassidy not only as a magnetic husband, but as a man who shaped her private world in ways she had never expected. By her own admission, he was not simply charming, he was persuasive to the point of overwhelming. She was young, eager to please, and in awe of his sophistication. He set the rhythm, and she followed. What captivated her most at first was Jack's confidence. He seemed to know exactly what he wanted, and he pulled her into his orbit with a force she had never experienced before. She later described him as a sexual Svengali, a figure who guided her through territories she had been sheltered from. These were not just small steps beyond her comfort zone. They were leaps. To Shirley, who had grown up in a conservative Pennsylvania household, the exposure was electrifying. The way she tells it, Jack became both teacher and conductor. He introduced her to experiences that she admits she would never have dared to explore alone. She credits him with opening doors in her personal life that made her feel alive, desired, and grown up. There is no coyness in her description. She wanted readers to understand that she was not simply the girl next door from Oklahoma. She was a woman whose marriage was built on intensity that sometimes bordered on obsession. But buried in those same accounts is an undertone that turns fascination into warning. Shirley acknowledges that while those moments were thrilling, they also left her dependent. The passion that felt like empowerment at first gradually tilted toward control. The more she allowed Jack to dictate the terms of their intimacy, the more she realized that he blurred boundaries. She found herself swept up in situations where she could not easily tell whether she was choosing or being chosen for. That tension between liberation and manipulation is one she describes with remarkable honesty. For years, fans assumed she had lived a clean, uncomplicated life while raising 3 sons and singing wholesome ballads on television. Instead, she admits she was living with a man who constantly pushed limits, sometimes for excitement, sometimes to remind her who held the reins. The paradox is what makes her story so unsettling. She was both enthralled and unsettled, fulfilled and uneasy, all at once. This duality sets the stage for what came next, because Jack's appetite for risk and variety was not confined to their marriage. What Shirley hints at here becomes undeniable in the next chapter. His charm was not exclusive. His boundaries did not stop at their front door, and the man who had taught her so much was living a double life that would soon explode into the open. The turning point in Shirley's account comes when she admits that Jack's intensity was never confined to their marriage. From the outside, they looked like a perfect show business couple. On the inside, she was learning that the charisma she fell for was spread far and wide. Jack Cassidy was not only unfaithful, he lived what she later described as a double life. Shirley says that his infidelity was not occasional or subtle. It was constant, unapologetic, and often reckless. She recalls times when his affairs were whispered about in the same circles where they both worked. What shocked her most, however, was not just the frequency, it was the range. Jack's charm reached across boundaries, and she revealed later that some of his affairs included men as well as women. In her memoir, she mentions names that startled readers, including the suggestion that Jack had been intimate with powerful figures in entertainment who rarely risked exposure in those days. For Shirley, this was more than betrayal. It was destabilizing because she had built her identity as his wife, his partner, and the mother of his children. To discover that he was constantly stepping outside of that role left her torn between anger and disbelief. The culture of the 1960s and 70s made it even harder. Divorce carried stigma, and being open about such affairs could have wrecked her career as quickly as it would have ruined his. Silence, for years, seemed like the only option. That silence, though, took its toll. Shirley admits that she compartmentalized, playing the wholesome star to the world while living with the knowledge that her husband's attention was always wandering. She describes moments of deep humiliation, times when she knew or even saw evidence of his straying. Yet she kept the family image intact because she did not feel she could do otherwise. What emerges from her recollections is not just a story of infidelity, but of duplicity woven into the fabric of daily life. Jack's lovers, male and female, were part of the same world she worked in. That closeness blurred lines that should never have been crossed. It left Shirley wondering how much of her marriage was real and how much was performance. Still, she never calls her marriage a mistake. She insists there was genuine love, passion, and connection. But she also insists on the truth. Jack lived 2 lives, and she was only one part of one of them. And as his appetites grew, so did the instability that surrounded them both. Because what started with affairs did not stop there. The next stage of her story reveals how the thrill of risk became tied to something far more dangerous, Jack's mental health unraveling before her eyes. By the early 1970s, Shirley's life with Jack had moved far beyond ordinary marital strain. She began to describe a home filled with unpredictability, days of brilliance and charm followed by nights of chaos. What once seemed like eccentricity hardened into something darker, signs of mental illness that neither of them fully knew how to confront. Shirley has spoken about Jack's extreme swings. At times he was radiant, bursting with ideas, and convinced he could conquer anything. At other times, he was restless, irritable, and reckless to the point of scaring her. Looking back, she uses words like manic to describe his behavior. Doctors eventually intervened, and there were moments when Jack faced psychiatric observation. For Shirley, the man who had once been her guide was becoming someone she could not predict or control. Alcohol made it worse. Drinking had long been part of Jack's social persona, but as the years went on, it became a crutch. Shirley recalls the way he would move from dazzling conversation into slurred frustration within hours. The mix of mania and alcohol meant he could swing from affectionate to combative without warning. Friends and family who spent time in their home later said the mood could change in minutes. The tension filtered into the children's lives. David Cassidy, their eldest son, who went on to his own fame, later reflected on the volatility he witnessed growing up. He connected his own later struggles with alcohol and dependency to what he had seen in his father. Shirley, meanwhile, carried the burden of keeping the family image stable for the public while privately bracing herself for Jack's eruptions. Fear crept into her routines. She describes nights when she would brace for shouting, mornings when she could not predict which version of Jack would come downstairs. He was still brilliant, still magnetic on stage, still able to charm a room full of strangers. But at home, the instability left her anxious, drained, and increasingly isolated. By 1974, Shirley had reached her breaking point. The marriage that had once felt intoxicating now felt unsafe. She filed for separation and then divorce the following year, bringing an end to nearly 2 decades of a union that had shaped and scarred her in equal measure. But even as the marriage ended on paper, their story did not. They shared children, history, and a bond that was not so easily untied. And then came the final act, because Jack's personal spiral did not stop with the divorce. In fact, it deepened. What followed was a family under pressure, a father wrestling with resentment, and a relationship that would remain complicated until his final night. The divorce in 1975 ended the marriage on paper, but it did not dissolve the ties that bound Shirley Jones and Jack Cassidy. They had shared nearly 20 years, raised 3 sons together, and built their lives around the same stages and studios. Walking away was never going to be clean. For Shirley, the end of the marriage was a relief, but it was also the beginning of a different kind of strain, one that pulled the entire family into Jack's orbit, even as he spiraled further. One of the sharpest tensions lay between Jack and his eldest son, David Cassidy. By the early 1970s, David was one of the most recognizable young stars in the world, thanks to the Partridge Family. His fame eclipsed Jack's, and by many accounts, Jack could not hide his resentment. Shirley has acknowledged that Jack wrestled with jealousy, seeing his own son adored in ways that he himself had once been. The dynamic strained the family, with Shirley caught between a husband she had left and a son struggling under the weight of sudden, overwhelming stardom. For Shirley, the divorce had been a decision for survival, yet she and Jack remained bound by the children and by history. They still crossed paths at family events and occasionally in professional circles. Despite the bitterness, she admits she could never cut him out entirely. Their connection was too complicated, half love, half damage, and impossible to reduce to one feeling. Even after the divorce, Jack would call her, sometimes to argue, sometimes to plead, and sometimes to reminisce about what they had shared. Shirley later recalled how confusing these interactions were. She no longer trusted him, but she still cared. She no longer wanted him as a husband, but she could not forget what they had been. And Jack, for all his charm, carried the anger of a man who had lost both his wife and his footing in the world. The children, meanwhile, felt the instability in different ways. Sean, Patrick, and Ryan each grew up aware that their father could be magnetic one moment and volatile the next. David, though from Jack's earlier marriage, felt the burden most publicly. He wrote later about the chaos of that household and how it shaped his own struggles as an adult. The ripple effect of Jack's decline spread across all of them. By late 1976, Shirley was settled in her decision to move forward without him. But Jack had not moved on. He was still drinking, still swinging between confidence and despair, still reaching out to Shirley in ways that left her conflicted. And then came the night when he called again, this time with an invitation that would turn into the most haunting memory of her life. The end of Jack Cassidy's story is as tragic as it is mysterious. On December 12, 1976, a fire broke out in his West Hollywood apartment. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. The official report said that Jack had likely fallen asleep with a cigarette in hand, sparking the blaze that took his life. He was just 49 years old. That is the version that made the papers. A straightforward accident. Another Hollywood talent lost too soon. But those who knew him, especially Shirley, have never remembered it in such simple terms. What the world called an accident carried with it years of instability, depression, and reckless choices that had been building long before that night. For Shirley, the fire was not just a random tragedy. It was the conclusion of a spiral she had lived through in real time. What makes the story sting even more is the detail Shirley has shared about the hours before the fire. Jack had reached out that evening. He wanted her to come over. He wanted to talk, maybe to reconcile, maybe just to be close again. She said no. She stayed home. And by morning, he was gone. In later years, she admitted how often she replayed that decision, wondering if her presence could have changed what happened, or if it would have simply placed her in danger too. The official cause remained accidental, but Shirley has implied that labeling it that way leaves too much unsaid. She has never claimed outright that Jack intended to harm himself. Instead, she frames it as the result of everything that had built up: his drinking, his manic energy, his recklessness, and his refusal to slow down even when life demanded it. The cigarette may have been the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for years. For their children, the loss was devastating. David, Sean, Patrick, and Ryan each carried their own memories of Jack's brilliance and volatility. For Shirley, the fire closed a chapter she had never truly been able to write herself out of. She was free of the chaos, but the cost was finality. There would be no more reconciliation, no more second chances, no more possibility of seeing Jack heal. It was this moment, the suddenness, the finality, the silence after the storm, that forced Shirley to reframe everything. The man who had once been her intoxicating guide, her greatest love, and her most difficult heartbreak was gone. All that remained was memory, rumor, and her choice to finally tell the story as it really was. And in her later years, she would explain that the devastating truth was not just the fire itself, but the years of denial that came before it. When Shirley Jones finally opened up in detail, decades after Jack Cassidy's death, she was not offering a new headline. She was offering perspective. At 91, she explained that the devastating truth was not simply about how Jack died, it was about who he was, what their life together really looked like, and what it cost her to stay silent for so long. In her own words, she had loved a man who was both brilliant and destructive. He taught her about passion, but also about fear. He gave her adventure, but also instability. She now admits that she spent years overlooking the warning signs, convincing herself that love and charisma could compensate for volatility and betrayal. That denial, she says, was its own form of damage. What makes her later admissions so powerful is that they strip away the myth of perfection. Fans wanted to believe in Shirley Partridge, the cheerful mother who solved every problem in 30 minutes. But Shirley insists that real life was nothing like that script. She had endured infidelity, manipulation, and volatility, all while keeping up a public image that demanded she smile through it. By finally speaking plainly, she shattered that illusion. Not for shock value, but for truth. She also confronted her own role in it. She does not portray herself as an innocent bystander. Instead, she acknowledges that she enabled certain patterns, that she stayed longer than she should have, and that she let fear of scandal silence her voice. That honesty is what makes her later reflections feel more like a confession than a memoir. She was not just exposing Jack, she was exposing herself. And yet, she does not erase the love. Shirley says she will never forget the moments of brilliance, the laughter, the music, and the connection that was real, even if it was tangled in pain. She still calls Jack one of the most magnetic people she ever met, but she balances that memory with the truth. Brilliance can coexist with cruelty. Love can live alongside damage. And sometimes the most captivating relationships are also the most destructive. The sting is not in reliving the fire that ended his life. The sting is in realizing that she had known for years that their love was unsustainable, and she still could not walk away until it nearly consumed her. By admitting that publicly, Shirley offered a lesson as well as a story. The truth she finally tells is that no matter how dazzling someone is, no matter how deep the connection feels, denying the harm can be as devastating as the harm itself. That is the legacy she shares now. The brilliance of Jack Cassidy, the turbulence of their marriage, and the final acknowledgement that survival sometimes requires telling the story exactly as it happened, even when the truth is painful. For Shirley, that admission is not just about Jack. It is about herself. And for everyone listening, it is a reminder that behind the brightest lights often lie the darkest shadows.